Hello everyone who is here with us for the 9th day of the London Kurdish Film Festival. I am here to present a masterclass run by Dr. William Brown, and the masterclass is titled Zero Budget Filmmaking. It has a short title, and the long version of it would be that obstacles are what you see when you take your eye off the goal, making films at any or rather no cost. So obviously this is about zero budget filmmaking. An issue that often comes up with young independent Kurdish filmmakers is that there are not enough money, basically. There are not many sponsors, there are no production company supporting the film, and there are no distribution agencies taking the films around to screenings and to film festivals. We here have someone who has a long experience in making zero budget films, then distributing them, producing and distributing them. He has had experience with different film festivals and different environments, different networks of filmmakers and audiences. Here is the description we have for this masterclass. In this interactive session, we shall discuss some of the history of no-budget and guerrilla filmmaking in order to think about why and how one might make guerrilla films today. We shall also consider ways in which to lean into whatever limitations one might face as a filmmaker, for example, working in uncontrolled conditions and or with an absence of professional equipment, in order nonetheless to produce work that is urgent and meaningful, and perhaps more so precisely because of those conditions and or technological limitations. Finally, we shall see if we have time at the end of this session to consider ways to get your films seen, especially outside of the always tricky world of film festivals. William Brown is a film scholar and a no-budget filmmaker. He is the author of Supercinema, Film Philosophy for the Digital Age, and Non-Cinema, Global Digital Filmmaking and the Multitude, and also with David H. Fleming, The Squid Cinema from Hell, Kinoteuthis Infernalis, and the Emergence of Chthulumedia, as his books, and also he has made several zero-budget films, including the 2009 En Attendant Godard. And I leave you with William and the masterclass. And if you would like to ask any questions, please do send them via the YouTube comment section or the Facebook comment section. And during the last few minutes of the masterclass, if we have time, I will send those questions to William so that he can answer them. Enjoy the session.
Thank you very much, Kaveh. Am I on? Perfect. Thank you very much, Kaveh, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's a real honor to take part in the London Kurdish Film Festival, and I'm delighted to be here. As Kaveh said in his very generous introduction, I've spent many years now making zero-budget films, which can be both a very rewarding and a very frustrating pastime. I will hope to emphasize primarily the rewards that are involved in it. I'll talk for about 45 minutes, I think, so we do have time for questions towards the end. And I'm going to run you through, if it's okay, my own sort of pathway into zero-budget filmmaking, which I'll then contextualize within a bit of film history and the film present, other filmmakers who are making similar kinds of work, before thinking about, in a pragmatic way, how one can work with one's limitations, technical limitations with performers and so on and so forth, in order to be perhaps not less expressive but more expressive. And this is why I've used this subtitle or title for the talk, Obstacles Are What You See When You Take Your Eye Off the Goal, which is actually a quotation attributed to Henry Ford, perhaps the most sort of archetypal capitalist in the history of sort of modernity, since he set up car manufacturing production lines and the automation of the world. So it's in some ways a kind of cheeky reappropriation of Ford's words to perhaps think about how to democratize filmmaking in such a way that everyone can make movies, as long as you're determined enough to do it. So I think I'll start just by sort of talking about budget definitions. When we say no budget, that can mean different things to different people. For example, in the UK, the British Film Institute defines low budget as being, this is low budget, as being films made from between £250,000 to £1 million, which for me is a massive budget. Micro budget is from £50,000 up to £250,000, which is a very large budget. And no budget is from £0 to £50,000. And £50,000 for me is still a massive amount of money. I've shot maybe 17, I've kind of lost count, 17 feature films in the last 10, 12 years. Some are fiction feature films, some are documentaries, some are more experimental and weird and might be what we would call essay films. And the budgets vary, but the least expensive has been made for £0, through to the most expensive probably was only about £5,000. And if people want to discuss how to raise money for films, then I'm sure that you could ask that in the question, but I probably have nothing necessarily original to say. You need to just ask all of your friends who have money to give you their money, and use things like Kickstarter, Indiegogo, and various other crowdfunding websites in order to help make money for films. I do have things to say about that, but I'll save that for questions if they come up. So to talk about how I got started in making films for myself, I started out as a would-be screenwriter. When I was first at university, I spent all of my time writing screenplays, probably more than I did studying, and was very determined to become a screenwriter after I'd graduated, and spent a long time writing scripts that it was very difficult to get produced. And indeed, in a kind of professional level, I still am awaiting a producer to greenlight one of my scripts so that it gets made into a wonderful, massive Hollywood film or British industrial movie. That hasn't happened yet. But I did come quite close in the early to mid 2000s with a script called Boxing Day, which was about a siege which took place in Hackney in 2003, during which a yardie called Eli Hall took a hostage of a chap called Paul Okeer, who's a migrant student from Nigeria who was living in London at the time. And Eli Hall, who was wanted by the police, basically took this hostage for 16 days from Boxing Day, the day after Christmas, in 2003, right through into the beginning of 2004, and disrupted life in Hackney on Mare Street and Graham Road in a big way. And this script was of interest for a short period of time with an actor called Idris Elba. I don't know if you've heard of Idris Elba, but he played Nelson Mandela, for example, in the recent film about Mandela, Long Walk to Freedom, as well as playing Stringer Bell in The Wire. So I was very excited at this point in my life. I'm kind of like, oh, great, I'm going to get a credit. And when you have a credit as a writer, that means you get more writing work. Everything is always about how you get started. If you can get one thing made, then it becomes easier and easier to get more things made. And what happens, though, as happens regularly in the film industry, is that what was close to going into production because of the attachment of an actor like Idris Elba ended up not happening. I think he probably went and made a film called Prometheus at around that point in time, or at least that's the story that I tell. And so Boxing Day didn't happen. Very frustrating. As a writer, you're always waiting for someone else to say yes to your projects. You're waiting at this traffic light that's red, and as they say, you know, for a project to get greenlit, you're waiting for the color of the light to change. Or to give a more literary example, you're a bit like Joseph K, waiting outside the door of the law, waiting for it to open. And I'll talk about Joseph K in Franz Kafka's novel The Trial a bit more in a second. So there I was sitting as a writer waiting for a green light, and then I thought, well, actually I could just go out and make a film myself. And so in 2009, in the summer of 2009, I had a camera which I bought It was quite an expensive camera at that point in time, about £2,000, and I bought it to make a promo for my family's company, basically. And so then I decided I was going to use this to make a film, and the film that I made was a film called En Attendant Godard, or Waiting for Godard, which Kaveh mentioned in his introduction. And that was a film that cost about £2,000 to make, and all in. And the expenses were basically getting my actors to travel from London, where we started filming, to Calais in France, where we continued, through to Paris, and then to a town called Rolle in Switzerland, which is the hometown now of the French New Wave filmmaker Jean-Luc Godard. And the story of the film is a guy who claims to be the illegitimate son of Jean-Luc Godard going in search of his father, which is why he goes first to Paris. He has no idea where Jean-Luc Godard lives, and so it's all about him hunting it down. And the idea, stylistically, with the film is that we go from a movie that imitates in style the very early films of Jean-Luc Godard, which in the 1950s, during what's referred to as the French New Wave, were very much characterized by rough and ready filmmaking on the streets of Paris, hiding their lightweight cameras inside shopping trolleys, going down the Champs-Élysées and filming whilst everyone around doesn't know that there's a film being made, through to his much sort of more contemplative, slower, sort of more politicized films in the 70s, through to a kind of synthesis of these styles in the 80s. So the idea was that within one film we go from early Godard through to this sort of later periods in Godard's work. So it's all very highfalutin, perhaps. But what I realized in making this film was that I had derived immense pleasure from going out and shooting stuff in a rough and ready fashion in public, with no need to cordon off areas for controlling things, and that actually having filmmaking taking place in an uncontrolled environment creates very exciting opportunities as well as very difficult challenges, particularly in relation to sound, which I can also talk about a bit later on. But having realized that I was very much enjoying this process, I basically decided to carry on making films in this fashion, and have done ever since. I suppose as far as En Attendant Godard in particular is concerned, I was very lucky also at around the time when I released the film to meet a very well-known film critic called Jonathan Rosenbaum, who Jean-Luc Godard himself described as the most important film critic since André Bazin, who is the founder of the Cahiers du Cinéma, this wonderful and great French film magazine, and which has been running for now nearly 80 years, 75 years. And so Jonathan Rosenbaum saw the film, and he endorsed it. He actually named it as one of his top 5 films of 2009 in a film magazine in the UK, the UK's equivalent of Cahiers du Cinéma, called Sight and Sound. And so even though it only has one mention in a long list, 100 critics all giving their films of the year, and only one Jonathan Rosenbaum mentions En Attendant Godard, all the same, from 2009, there are these films like Avatar, Inglourious Bastards, and then this little no-budget movie, En Attendant Godard, named there. And actually that was just that mention, that single mention in a single paragraph alone was instrumental in a lot of the life of that film, as it went on to have screenings. It premiered at CPH Pix in Copenhagen before playing in places like the Northwest Film Forum in Seattle. And one of my favorite achievements or accomplishments with that film was it was selected as one of the opening films for a new cinema at Emerson College in Boston, Massachusetts, where it played alongside films by Godard and Fritz Lang. So again, sort of slightly bizarre to find oneself kind of having made a film almost as a dare or to oneself, having a film then also screening alongside work by these great cineasts. And like I say, this is something that I found very enjoyable, and so have ever since sort of been pursuing this challenge of wanting to make films with no money, really. It's a challenge that I think is more spurs me on far more than what can I do with $1 million, or what could I do with $100 million, or any of these sort of ridiculous budgets that filmmakers have. And I think that in my capacity as a teacher, as someone who teaches film students in different parts of the world and for a good number of years now, it strikes me that many students really want to make films. Many students are already making films, but that we can create communities of filmmakers working really with minimal resources, and that this is how the language of cinema itself progresses. And so in some senses, this is why I can talk a bit about history and have a kind of film historical lesson here, because I think that the history of cinema, as much as it's defined by great filmmakers, typically men like Stanley Kubrick, or indeed James Cameron, it is also a medium that's defined in its more artistic and certainly in its more political modes by filmmakers working with really quite severe limitations, both in terms of budget and in terms of resources more generally, equipment, especially perhaps. And so typically, if I were to talk about a history of sort of no budget or guerrilla filmmaking, I might sort of turn to Latin America as a very interesting starting point. Even in the early 20th century, the Revolution and the exploits of Pancho Villa, who was engaged in an uprising within Mexico in order to try to bring democracy to the country. His exploits were filmed, and those films were very much a part of the effort in order to help bring about a revolution that would lead to the introduction of democracy in Mexico. And so Pancho Villa is a kind of key personality in the history of guerrilla filmmaking, even if he was the star of his films as opposed to the maker of his films. We can jump forward about 50 years from the sort of early 1900s through to the mid to late 1950s, but stay in Latin America and think of Cuba. And in Cuba, in the 1950s, after the revolution in 1958, in the late 1950s, we have the introduction of what the Cuban filmmaker Julio Garcia Espinosa called imperfect cinema. I don't know if you've seen a film called a film from 1955, the name of which escapes me, with Marlon Brando. I can Google it quickly whilst I try to remember the film. Guys and Dolls. I didn't need to Google it. Forgive my brain memory from going there. I'm going to talk about Guys and Dolls quickly, and I was going to do a PowerPoint with little clips, but I suspect that technologically playing a clip that's playing on my PowerPoint via Skype, then onto a live feed on YouTube and Facebook would just lead to too many complications. So perhaps you can look up these clips at a later point in time. But Guys and Dolls is this film that features Marlon Brando as a crook who has a bet with his friend, played by Frank Sinatra, that he can take Gene Simmons's Salvation Army charity worker on a date, and he chooses as the destination of their date Havana in Cuba. And it's really interesting when we watch that sequence in the film where they go on this date in Havana, because this is 1955. This is before the Cuban Revolution, and we see these American tourists basically rolling around Havana. It's this tourist destination. They remark upon all of this wonderful architecture that they see, and then they get drunk, or Marlon Brando gets Gene's character drunk, giving her dulce de leches that she doesn't know are alcoholic. It's all very dodgy from the contemporary perspective, getting a date drunk without her knowing, but all the same. There is something sort of really interesting going on here, because it teaches us about how in the 1950s, prior to the revolution, Cuba was the playground of the USA, and it was a country in which people went and had fun, a bit like English tourists go off on stag weekends to all different parts of Europe and annoy the locals with their boorish behaviour. So it was sort of very much this playground, and somewhere that wasn't considered to have a reality for itself, but was only considered to have a reality for the North Americans. And there is this sort of very interesting moment when they're on the date where they walk past a tramp who's lying on a bridge, And whenever I show this clip to my students, I say, well, why is the tramp in this shot? And, you know, it's clear that a tramp didn't just walk onto the film set and lie down and they just kind of went, they filmed the sequence. They went, oh, there was a tramp in the shot. Oh, well, don't worry, let's just keep it. There's clearly a part of part of the picture, part of the mise en scène was very deliberate. And Joseph Mankiewicz, the director of Guys and Dolls, is clearly including this image of the tramp deliberately in order to let us know that even though we're seeing Marlon Brando, this great star, Gene Simmons, this great star, treating Havana as a playground, there is something not quite right in Cuba, and that actually there is great inequality in Cuba, and that there are homeless people who are living there, even though there are also these tourists and those who are benefiting from American tourism. This is 1955. Well, 3 years later, we have a revolution that takes place very famously through the deeds of Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. And what happens is that once the revolution has taken place, and during which Cuba is hoping to establish a more egalitarian society in which there is less disparity between the rich and the poor, but instead a kind of equality, that dependent relationship between Cuba and North America suddenly ends. Cubans love movies. Cubans go to the movies the whole time. Cubans make movies. But once, after the 1950s revolution has taken place, filmmakers are now not given movies to watch because North America says, no, you can't watch our films since you've revolted and don't want to be having a dependent relationship with the USA. And they also now have less access to equipment, and certainly to the repairing of equipment and so on, because most of this equipment is sourced from the US, from the north. So what happens is Julio Garcia Espinosa, who's this filmmaker, basically decides, well, you know, actually, let's not work against the idea that you know, we don't have access to the best equipment anymore, and let's not work against the idea that our films therefore will not look as good as North American films, which everyone has been watching up until now and to which they're very used, the films that they're most used to. Let's actually work with this, and let's use this kind of perceived deficiency in equipment to create a whole new style of cinema, what he called an imperfect cinema. So rather than having this technical perfection with these bright colors in Technicolor, with this amazing sound, which you have in a film like Guys and Dolls, actually we're going to make films that use this grain, the grain of the kind of low gauge film camera, the 16mm camera. We're going to make films which don't have sort of perfect sound and which rely upon voiceover, films which actually reach out into the real world rather than create studios and a fake Havana that we have in Guys and Dolls. Which is very much set in a studio rather than actually going to Havana. Let's lean into the real world and let's make our films actually imperfect. And let's call this aesthetic, this is the aesthetic of the revolution. What does the new reality of Cuba look like? It looks like these imperfect films. And so actually, it's not that these films are deficient or inferior because they don't have the budget or the technical equipment that the films from the US have. This is actually to their advantage. This is expressive use of these tools. And so for me, Julio Garcia Espinosa, who also wrote about imperfect cinema, is a huge sort of point of influence for me in terms of thinking about no-budget filmmaking. And he's someone to whom I like to introduce my students and whose work I think is of great importance still today. And another example that I like to talk about with my students is an Argentine filmmaker, again still in Latin America, called Fernando Birri. And Fernando Birri was based in a northern town in Salta for a while, and there he would teach students how to make films. But they had one big problem. They didn't actually have any film cameras. What they had were photographic cameras and audio recorders, voice recording machines. But this was not going to be a problem for Birri. Instead, he got his filmmakers to go out and to make films using only still images and sound recordings. So in some senses, even if you don't have a camera, you still have no obstacles stopping you from making a film. If you don't have a video camera, a film camera, you can still create images. And if we think about the era of the internet today, which by definition everyone who's here knows about because we're using it right now, you also have it right in front of you and in a huge archive of images and sounds. So even if you didn't have a smartphone, which everyone obviously praises as being a tool that all filmmakers can use these days, and I think it's very much the case that the smartphone is a fantastic tool for filmmaking these days. Even if you didn't have one of those, you still have a whole archive of images and sounds that you can use and appropriate and reappropriate for yourself in order to give expression to what it is that you want to say. And so for me, thinking about these histories and thinking about how filmmakers in Latin America in particular, in these examples, have not been afraid of a lack of access to equipment, but instead have used this to their advantage. For me, I take courage from those examples, and they become for me heroes, the kinds of filmmakers into whose traditions I would like to fit. Just to refer a little bit to Julio Garcia Espinosa once again, just to say that, because this is also tied to a revolution, this idea of using this perceived inferior or imperfect filmmaking equipment in order to give expression to a new Cuban reality, because it's tied to this revolution, it seems clear that there is a political component to this. And this is a subtle, perhaps sort of quite academic point, but it's a point that I think is very important to make, which is that aesthetics and politics are tied together. Aesthetics, what is that? That's kind of how a film looks. A film that looks kind of very shiny and glossy because it was made in Technicolor, that's its aesthetic. A film that is sort of very rough and ready, has imperfect sound, has jump cuts, mixes documentary and fictional footage, that's also its aesthetic. And these mean something. These have a politics to them. And it's important to know that I think that when you make low-budget films, what you're doing is you are making statements about the world, or at least you have an opportunity to make a statement about the world. And sometimes when you work with your low budget as opposed to against it, you can actually make your statement more powerful as opposed to less powerful. And I'm going to come forward now into the contemporary moment and think about a few films and filmmakers from the last few years who work with low or tiny budgets, or at least with imperfect filmmaking equipment, in order to say something very interesting. So a few years ago, a filmmaker called Sean Baker made a movie called Tangerine. Tangerine is a very well-known film. It did very well internationally on the festival circuit, as well as getting releases in numerous countries. And it's a film that tells the story of transsexual sex workers in Los Angeles on Christmas Eve. And it stars various actors of color, as well as being shot on the streets in a kind of guerrilla style, famously using an iPhone that had some lens adjustments that Baker had made with it. So it's lauded as this kind of like iPhone classic in some ways, and there are many iPhone films these days that we could refer to, but I'm going to stick to Tangerine because I sort of half imagine that if Sean Baker went to a Hollywood producer and said, look, I've got this film I really want to make, and I think I need $50 million to make it. It's about transsexual sex workers in Los Angeles on Christmas Eve, and about a kind of struggle to get some money together in order to sort of survive, which is what happens in the film. And the producer would be like, oh yeah, that kind of reminds me of It's a Wonderful Life, which is another film set on Christmas Eve, and which is a classic with James Stewart in it, and which is, one of the Hollywood great films. So, I think, yeah, if we remade It's a Wonderful Life in this way, this could work really well. So why don't you have George Clooney to play one of these transsexual sex workers? That might work. And Sean Baker being like, yeah, I'm not sure that we need George Clooney for this. I actually have some authentic actors in mind. I think that George Clooney, much as he's a wonderful actor, would probably, bring something a little bit sort of unrealistic to this because he's too well known as George Clooney. And so the producer is kind of like, oh, okay, well, if you're not going to have George Clooney, then obviously we're going to lower the budget. We'll drop down to sort of, let's say, 20 million. But, still, if we had less famous actors, we could still do this all kind of like in a studio in such a way that we have, a very controlled environment, and so that we can get a nice, efficient shoot together. And Sean Baker saying, no, look, Sean Baker saying, sorry, I don't think we can do this in a studio, because what I want is a kind of authenticity. I want to show the real Los Angeles, and I've been working for several years with this sex workers community, and I've made all these contacts, and I think that these actors will be great. So again, the producer will be like, not going to the studio, then your budget shrinks. And so the point that I'm trying to make here is that a film like Tangerine actually needs to look, in some ways, the sort of the low budget way that it does, not least because, in these sort of times, conservative times, producers who hear that a film is about transsexual sex workers might think that that's a bit niche. They might think, yeah, that's not kind of like mainstream popular appeal. Maybe RuPaul's Drag Race, would justify it a little bit. But basically, this is a show, or this is a film that won't reach mainstream audiences. And so again, in what we might call an economy of scale, the budget of the film is affecting the look of the film, but that's also affecting the politics of the film. In order for a film like Tangerine to actually give us something like an authentic perspective on the lives of transsexual sex workers in Los Angeles on Christmas Eve, it needs, in some ways, to be working in this low-budget fashion. And so in some senses, what Sean Baker understands with a film like Tangerine is exactly how this low-budget approach is what strengthens the case of his film. It strengthens the realism, it strengthens the authenticity, it takes us into a true world rather than simply an imagined world of transsexual sex workers, or the fantasy world of that a big budget Hollywood film might offer to us. And so I think that, these, again, are kind of like examples of contemporary filmmakers who understand how aesthetics and politics are linked. And it's not just confined to the USA, having given Sean Baker as a Western example. I think that there are filmmakers in the Philippines. I think of someone like Khan de la Cruz, filmmakers in China, certainly sort of early works by Jia Jianke, through to contemporary filmmakers like Yang Ming, who are working with sort of minimal budgets in order to make their films, or perhaps to bring it a bit closer to home, filmmakers in Iran who are working with no budget. He's a controversial figure, but someone like Jafar Panahi, who makes films, at least while purportedly under house arrest, but who uses these sort of conditions of non-filmmaking in order to make his movies. So for me, there's something sort of very important and expressive that can be achieved through a lack of budget, as opposed to working with a big budget. So I've sort of spoken a bit about aesthetics, politics. I'm just going to sort of add perhaps a kind of a philosophical point to make here, and it ties in with the title of the talk, obstacles are what you see when you take your eye off the goal. In fact, we can turn those obstacles into opportunities always. And I'm going to turn to literature briefly in order to do this, and talk about three writers who I think are very important influences for me in terms of why and how I make low-budget, zero-budget films. And the first is a writer that I've already mentioned, Franz Kafka. So Kafka is very famous for a story called The Metamorphosis, in which a character called Gregor Samsa wakes up one morning as an ungeheures Ungeziefer, or a monstrous vermin. And what's interesting for me is that when we think about Kafka as a writer, he's a Czech Jew who writes in German. And there's a couple of French philosophers called Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari who write about Kafka at some length. And they talk about his work as being an example of minor literature. And they say that the reason why Kafka is minor literature is because even though he's a Czech Jew, he writes neither in Yiddish nor in Czech, he writes in German. Why? Because in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where Kafka's writing, German is the major spoken language. And so Kafka writes in the language that is not his own. But what Kafka does when he writes in the language that's not his own is that he writes in this language as if he were an alien, or as if he were a kind of ungeheures Ungeziefer himself. Kafka himself is, like Gregor Samsa, the monstrous vermin. He wakes up in a reality where he is considered by others to be sort of weird and an outsider. And his language is doing very similar work. It sort of disrupts the major language of German, and instead he sort of creates a whole new language from within that language, as opposed to sort of trying to go back into the past and to recover, to learn how to write in a sort of Czech or Yiddish languages with which he's less familiar. Similarly, there's a French writer called Georges Perec, who wrote a novel called La Disparition, which would literally be translated as something like the disappearance, or perhaps the death, if you were going to sort of have a slightly more figurative translation, but it's often translated into English as a void. And the reason why it's translated as a void is because the translation is just like the novel itself. The novel itself is a novel that doesn't feature the letter E, which is weird. The letter E is the most commonly used letter in the English and in the French languages. And so to set yourself the task of writing without the letter E is kind of like crazy, basically. Who would do this? But Perec did this because in George there's 2 E's and in Perec there's 2 E's. So there's 4 E's in his name. And he decided to write a novel without the letter E in it in order to see whether it was possible. And this is even translated without the letter E in it, which is why it's called A Void. And Perec said, well, the reason why I do this is because in the same way that when Oedipus goes blind, he realizes that he gains greater knowledge and he can see, so is it in some ways that it's when we, in effect, tie our hands behind our backs that we can learn how to use our hands or the importance of our hands all the more truly. And so, this also is sort of an example for me of how he deliberately embraces a limitation to disrupt the kind of the easy flow with which we might express ourselves, and instead to force himself to be creative and to express himself in a new and different fashion. And my last literary example would then be James Joyce, which fits into this. So James Joyce is an Irish writer who, a bit like Kafka, who writes in German, Joyce is an Irish writer who writes in English. Why does he write in English? Because Ireland is a country that's been colonized by the English, by the British, for a long time. And English is the language in which he's been educated, even though it is not the language, of his nationality, not the language perhaps of his birth even. But again, rather than writing in Gaelic, learning Gaelic and going and writing in a language that is a minority language, this would be to mythologize the reality of what it means to be Irish. If you are Irish, English is the language that is imposed upon you. So you definitely write in English, but you write in English in such a way that you disrupt it. You make it mean new things so that from within English, you find an Irish mode of expression, let's say. And so for me, early on in Joyce's career, in The Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, Joyce writes about how, actually his imagination has been colonized because he can only think in English, and English isn't his language. So as an Irishman, how can he express himself? And then when we get to his later novels, Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, he's writing these kind of like mega sentences that last pages, where words bleed into each other and there's no punctuation. And what in some ways we might even consider sort of bad writing from a sort of colonial perspective. If I were an English teacher, an English teacher at an Irish school, be like, Joyce, your writing is terrible. But he's doing this deliberately because he's trying to create this new language from within this mainstream language. And I talk about Joyce because it allows us to start thinking about film, and it allows us to start thinking about film in this way. Is that I can't speak for everyone because everyone has different experiences, but certainly for most people in the West, not necessarily in terms of the language that we speak, but definitely in terms of the films that we watch, most people are brought up on Hollywood cinema. It's the most powerful cinema and it's globally dominant. And so in the same way that the language that we speak affects what it is that we can think and how it is that we can think, so is the audiovisual media that we consume and with which we engage, shaping how it is that we can think and what it is that we can think. And if Hollywood and American sort of television shows and so on are the media that we most commonly consume as we're growing up, then in some ways these media are shaping how we think and what it is that we can think. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not to say that, Hollywood films cannot give us, positive messages or make us think interesting thoughts. I'm sure that that is possible, and that there's some truth in that. But it is, at the same time, I'm not from Hollywood, and I'm not American, for example. And so if I want to give expression to what it is to be me, who's not from Hollywood, then I need to develop a new language. I need to develop a new audiovisual language to give expression to my reality and to my outlook on the world and to my vision of things. And so in some senses, when I realized that my life isn't a Hollywood movie, and I realized that my life isn't really anything like a Hollywood film, rather than thinking, oh, therefore I should make my life into as much of a Hollywood movie as possible, which is how I think a lot of people do try to shape their lives. For me, I think the opposite. I think, no, I don't want to make my life into a Hollywood movie. I want to develop a whole new language using this technology, cinema, in order to give expression to my world. So I begin to feel a bit like Gregor Samsa. I begin to feel a bit like Stephen Dedalus, the character from James Joyce's novels, in the sense that I've been given this language, but it's not my own, and it's not giving expression to who I am and to my reality. And so I need now to kind of find a way to develop a new language. And I can think about George Perec and refusing to use the letter E. And so now I'm thinking, well, actually what I could do is make films in which I never use a close-up. That might be the equivalent of telling a story without the letter E in a filmic fashion, or I can only use found footage, or I can only use still images, in thinking about Fernando Birri and the way in which he was teaching filmmaking in Salta in Argentina. And so, in fact, beginning to think here that these obstacles, oh, I don't have access to equipment, oh, I don't have actors, oh, I don't have all manner of different things, a budget to pay people. Actually, these can be things that we can use to our advantage, that these can actually help us express ourselves even more. And I think that there was one film for me that stood out of the many films at this year's London Kurdish Film Festival that I think really speaks this sort of guerrilla language in a way more than others, certainly from those which were in competition, and that would be For Camera, a very self-conscious film in some ways, given the title. But certainly if you haven't had a chance to look at it yet, I would definitely go have a check that out, basically, if you can, before the festival ends, because I think that that's a film that's very clearly been made working with limitations, with sort of shaky handheld rather than very smooth composed images, working with non-professional performers who may or may not have been fully aware of what was being filmed, or when filming started, when filming ended, and so on and so forth. But I think that this is a wonderful example for me of the films at the festival now that embodies in some ways this sort of guerrilla ethos. And what that does, even if the film is very challenging and very problematic in terms of its engagement with both sort of systematic violence, authoritarianism, state violence, as well as domestic violence, it's also a very brave film. As many of my fellow jurors, I'm also been working as a jury member for the Lkff this year, have also kind of commented, and so I think that this is a movie that is really worth sort of paying attention to if you get the chance to have a look at it. A note I would say is when I talk about how actually we could embrace this idea of tying our hands behind our backs, or making our films with our eyes closed, being like Oedipus, blinded but now able to see, or thinking about making a story without the letter E, or without a close-up, or without a long shot, or without sound. Actually, there are filmmakers, again, who've been doing this sort of thing. And one film that I enjoy sort of showing to my students, and which might be worth checking out as a way of getting some inspiration to do this, is a film called The Five Obstructions, which is by Lars von Trier, a very controversial filmmaker, and Jørgen Leth, another Danish filmmaker who is from an older generation to von Trier, but very inspirational to von Trier, and whom von Trier challenges to remake a film that he shot back in the 60s 5 different times, but this time with a load of different limitations. So the old film is called A Perfect Human, and von Trier says to Lkff, well, this time you actually can't make this film using anything other than shots that are 12 frames or half a second in duration. And so now Lkff has to make a movie that's only 12 frames and it's cutting the whole time. And how do you do that? How do you overcome this challenge? And Lkff absolutely kind of learns that actually these challenges are opportunities for him. And when I teach guerrilla filmmaking over the course of a whole semester rather than just during a one-hour masterclass, I absolutely basically set such challenges for my students. And so if you're beginning to think about making films for yourself, one of the ways that you can do this would be to think about, well, actually, what challenges can I set for myself? Can I make a film using only found footage from the internet, but which explains what life is like in my village, even though so where I grew up, for example, I had a village of 100 people. No film has ever been shot there, as far as I'm aware. But I think if I went to find other movies of small villages and then try to kind of put together a found footage film of stuff that I took from the internet that gave expression to that, that could be a really interesting challenge, for example. Or what does it mean? One that I set for my students is make a film using only still images, and which explains what it means to be in Great Britain these days. The UK is a country that has its own sort of flourishing and problematic history, and certainly its own flourishing recent history with regard to sort of nationalism and these kinds of ideas which are floating around. But it's sort of very interesting to get people to think about, well, how would I say what I want to say about what it means to be in Great Britain using only photographs, but a succession of photographs, rather than using moving images and so on. So for me, these are sort of really important and interesting ways that one can use to sort of go forward with one's filmmaking, is to set yourself these kind of challenges. Put your hand behind your back, do things one-handed, put your leg, kick my screen, too enthusiastic, but put your leg behind your head and see what it's like to film from that perspective. Put your camera on the floor and only shoot from the floor perspective, and see whether these bring out new ways of saying things that otherwise might have been sort of just too easy to say, that will make your film unremarkable. Everyone always shoots from the shoulder, everyone always shoots from sort of this kind of angle, but actually if you move, if you get about, particularly with a tool like this, which is so mobile and which can move about, then you develop new ways of telling your stories and ways that might actually give more expression to what it is that is true to you and true to your reality than simply copying how it is that other people make films. Now, if you don't copy how other people make films, and this is where I'm going to talk about audiences in a kind of guerrilla style, and I'll talk a bit about festivals, and then we'll kind of wrap up. You're always running a risk, basically. If you don't copy how other people make films, there's always the risk that you're just going to be a bit weird. And people will think, well, that's just kind of like, I don't even understand the language that this film is speaking, because it's sort of so strange to me. And that's always a risk. And you can go full on and basically go as weird as you can, but understand that it might be very difficult for a lot of people to follow that film style. But that doesn't mean that you're any less valid as a filmmaker for doing it. And it certainly means that you're very brave in doing that. So there's always perhaps a kind of compromise that you need personally to think about in terms of how much you want not to copy other people and deliberately not copy other people, and how much you want perhaps to explore your individuality. Because, when you put yourself out there, and I think, for me, filmmaking is a kind of exposure of self in some ways, even if I'm not in my films. There's always that kind of nerve-wracking moment where everyone's watching it and you're going, oh no, they think it sucks. I'm really scared that they think it sucks. It's too weird. Why did I do this? I'm full of regret. In some ways, you have to learn to be strong, and think about how to find your audiences. If you're full on weird, you need to find allies. And this is, so there's an important lesson about networking here, is, find other filmmakers who are seeking to explore new ways of making films with you. And there are many ways of doing that, but for me, finding an ally in Jonathan Rosenbaum, for example, was a very important moment for me in helping a film like En Attendant Godard to get out there. I also perhaps think about how you frame your film. If a film is full on weird, maybe it can speak for itself, but in some ways you might need to explain to people to expect that it's full on weird, because if a film is full on weird, but people are told that it's going to be full on weird, then they're more prepared for it and they're perhaps more likely to sort of try to engage with it. Choose where you show your film relatively carefully. And I say this more from an economic perspective. I've made a feature film called Common Ground for £500 in 2012. And I think it's still a very good film. I think it's a great film. It's a kind of quasi-documentary about a guy who's going looking for his missing brother, set against the backdrop of what was taking place at the end of 2011 and into 2012, which was the Occupy movement. And we did some sort of shooting on one of the sites of Occupy London, just by St. Paul's Cathedral. And I think it was kind of very timely film, but also, I ended up spending more on festival submissions for that film than I spent on that film, and with no success, or with little success. We had a few screenings in Portugal and in the USA, but it was actually quite hard to fit that film into people's sort of imaginations at that point in time. And after I probably spent about £500-600 on submissions, having spent £500 on the film, I kind of went, what, I could have made another film rather than sort of spent all this money trying to get this film seen. So, think about your submissions carefully. We can all have a great ambition to get our movie into Sundance, for example, but Sundance receives about 4,000, 5,000 films a year, and it generally only has about 125 places. So you have, broadly speaking, a sort of 1 in 30 or 40 chance of getting in. Or at least that's what you'd think. But actually a festival like Sundance probably only takes unsolicited films, 3 or 4, or sort of 3 or 4%. So 5 out of 125 movies screened at Sundance might well come from that pool of movies that have been submitted sort of without anyone knowing someone at the festival. The 120 spots out of the 125, those are filled by brokering through well-established networks of agents and representatives and directors and programmers and so on. And so if you're kind of outside of that and you give to Sundance, $75 in order to consider your film, of course, you're welcome to do that if you have the money. But, you're actually looking at getting, one place out of 5. And if there are 5,000 submissions, that means you have a sort of 1 in 1,000 chance of getting one of those places. There's nothing wrong with taking those odds. Lots of people play the lottery, even though the odds are very small of winning it. So, feel free to do that. But my advice might be that after a while, perhaps it's worth thinking about how to develop your own networks and screenings. There is an internet out there. There are film magazines out there. You could talk to a film magazine online about showcasing your work as a premiere. You could develop your own websites. You can, of course, distribute your own work on YouTube. You can distribute your own work on Vimeo. And these are increasingly legitimate platforms, I think. There was a movie, another American film called Four-Eyed Monsters, which came out in cinemas in the sort of early to mid 2000s. And it was a kind of low budget indie sort of masterpiece in some ways, or at least sort of low budget classic, Four-Eyed Monsters. But its filmmakers always sort of felt unhappy when Four-Eyed Monsters didn't really get the kind of big mainstream cinema releases. It had had a festival run at which it did very well, and then it came out online. And the filmmakers never really made much money at it, but they did get over probably sort of something like 1 million viewers online in the full sort of run of the film's life. And actually that's a huge audience and highly respectable compared to even a sort of theatrically released sort of mid-level independent film. So don't sniff at the internet. It's actually a very powerful tool. And for me as a filmmaker, I think of myself almost as a door-to-door salesperson. Sometimes I have 50 people turn up to a screening. I think the most would be about 120. Sometimes it's 6, sometimes it's 10, and sometimes it's 1. I've been at film screenings where one person other than myself has turned up. But I think that even that's a success. There's a chance always to be sort of showing your work to filmmakers. I remember seeing a making of, sort of behind the scenes film of the Maysles brothers' Grey Gardens, one of the great documentary films from the 70s. The Maysles brothers are one of the great sort of documentary filmmaking team, great documentary filmmakers. And it was a screening in Chicago, which is one of the major American cities. And this was a few years ago. And I think Albert Maysles was there before he passed away, taking a Q&A. And at one point, the camera panned round, and here's Albert Maysles, one of the great documentary filmmakers. And here's Grey Gardens, one of the great documentary films. And there must have been 15 people in the audience. And I'm like, well, if Albert Maysles will show Grey Gardens in Chicago, a major city, to an audience of 15, then I will certainly be very happy showing my film to an audience of sort of 7 or 8 or 10 or 15 or 1, because, you know, every screening is wonderful and everything is a chance to kind of show your work to different people and to communicate. So for me, that's sort of very important. Last things, just to say about Guerrilla Style, when you're on your film, even if you're going full weird, if you're working with other people, always communicate what it is that you're trying to do, because, you know, leaving other people in the dark is both perhaps misleading, but also sort of quite problematic. You won't get what you want if you don't tell people what it is that you want. But there are hundreds of people, the countless people out there who actually end up giving their so much time and effort towards a project, particularly if they understand what it is. So communicate, be honest. Be honest also, be honest with, especially with non-actors. Be prepared. By be prepared, I mean you can turn up in the middle of nowhere, sort of hoping, you can turn up in the middle of a street hoping that, you know, no cars will come by and that you'll get a nice clean shot, but that's kind of unrealistic. So be prepared for that. For there to be delays if you are after something very particular, or try to work with the cars. Oh, there's so many cars going past. Well, you know what? I'm going to make that into a feature. Let's just have only cars instead of trying to wait until there are no cars going past. And then finally, always think about sound. Always think about sound. If you want a clean sound recording, it's very difficult to achieve out in the wild. But I will leave it at that. And if we have any Q&As, then I'd be delighted to sort of talk with people. But I hope that was interesting. Sorry for enthusiastically kicking my screen at one point. And, you know, good luck with all of your filmmaking projects. Hope that they go very well, and I look forward to seeing them at future festivals, including future iterations of the London Kurdish Film Festival.
Thank you so much, William. This has been really enlightening, and I personally very much enjoyed it. We have one question. I would be thankful if you could answer this. You obviously touched on some aspects of it, but perhaps you can elaborate. So the question is a rather long question. So here it is. Zero budget filmmaking in your masterclass include the stages of does the concept of zero budget filmmaking in your masterclass include the stages of distribution? Usually this is the stage that a lot of filmmakers struggle in exposing their films. For Kurdish filmmakers facing quite a bit of censorship in the media, following the reference you made to the Latin American filmmakers who managed to release their zero budget films to the point where it brought on a revolution, do you think that kind of potential is even available for Kurdish filmmakers who face this? I mean, so considering the censorship, basically, how does that look like?
I mean, it's a fabulous question and a very important one. I don't know that I can speak specifically about Kurdish filmmakers, but I think that there are many examples of underground filmmakers in Iran, China, the Philippines, as well as in Latin America, you know, who use unconventional means of distribution. So unofficial cinema clubs, unofficial gatherings of people to watch films. In Argentina, for example, the kind of revolutionary filmmakers, Fernando Solanas and Octavio Getino, would take their films around factories, gather the factory workers at union meetings, have all of the workers watch the films at union meetings, and use that as a means to sort of help to bring about social change through calls for strikes and these kinds of things. And so it may not be in cinemas and it may not even be at film festivals, but I think, you know, even if you know a space, there is a saying that like every wall is a screen. You know, if you know a space where there's a wall, and you can project a film on it, or even a fragment of a film on it, and reach an audience, then I think that that's very important. Can this be done without risk? I'm not sure that I can guarantee this. I think that, but this is part of the political gesture of what it means to be, if you will, a guerrilla filmmaker, is that there will always be, there might well always be a risk in certain contexts anyway, in such things. And a lot of filmmakers, in China, for example, end up, being in trouble with the authorities because of the sort of both the underground nature of what it is that they're showing, for example, films about homosexuality, whilst at the same time, also perhaps only loosely being officially endorsed by the government if there's a screening, and then sometimes those screenings are shut down and the people who organize them are, taken into custody, at least temporarily. So for me, the phrase is kind of like by any means necessary. But, I suppose, you have to understand that there may be risks, and obviously the choice is personal as to whether you wish to take those risks. I admire anyone with the courage to do so, but I can understand, if there's too much of a risk for certain people. But I would imagine that, there are so many ways for people to gather, even if it's virtually today, using VPNs, for example, in order to kind of mirror stuff, so that audiences can join from seemingly different places in order to be able to see work. So I would hope that, I agree, distribution, and particularly kind of officially recognized distribution, is always an ongoing issue. Festivals like the London Kurdish Film Festival exist to help many filmmakers, but of course even the London Kurdish Film Festival can't show every film that's submitted to it, and those filmmakers shouldn't necessarily feel that their work is any less important or any less worthwhile, but they have to perhaps be creative also in that. And this is, it's very interesting. In some ways you realize that to be a guerrilla filmmaker is not just to be a director. That's the talk of very industrial filmmaking. A guerrilla filmmaker is a writer, producer, director, often the editor, often involved in the distribution, their own sales agent, all of these things, these are all jobs that you have to do, and it can make it very time consuming when you want to be getting on with making new and other work. But this is sort of part of how it works. And it's an anecdote, but the punk movement in the UK, when the Sex Pistols played their first concert, there were only 13 people at that concert. But what did the Sex Pistols become? Or Van Gogh, the painter, never sold a painting in his life. Kafka never published a novel actually in his life. He asked for his work to be burnt, and Max Brod basically brought it to the public's attention. There are many examples of how things seem to be not successful at the time but become successful afterwards. And I think you have to have the belief in yourself and in your work to continue in spite of any setbacks, and think that perhaps these are ways to, again, try to think about these things as opportunities. We all get a bit depressed, for sure, and I imagine, perhaps there's a special case to be made for, how Kurdish filmmakers can be very dispirited at times, but, solidarity, and hopefully, we will all get to see some fabulous work, and very important work as much as possible.
Thank you so much, William. Thank you. I think that's it for the questions. And let me see if you receive anything. Thank you so much. I really thank you. That was really useful for myself, and I'm sure for our audience who are watching this live now, or this video will be available on our YouTube channel. So for anyone who is watching later on. And this is to our audience. Thank you so much for being here with us. Our screenings and our program today ends here, and tomorrow is the last day of our festival. As usual, we start at 5, but then don't forget about the closing ceremony, the live closing ceremony at 7:30, where the programming team and the jury will be present, and to announce the 4 awards that we are giving out this year, which are the best short film, the 2 special mentions of the jury, and the Lkff honorary award. Thank you for being with us, and thank you, William, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you, Kaveh. Thanks for the opportunity. Thank you, everyone for listening, watching. Take care.
به کیف خوشی تماشا بکنید.